So I've always found there to be a peculiar kind of beauty to the way some TF2 weapons have been balanced over the years. Some weapons have been broken on launch and therefore have gone through rigorous balancing changes to try and get them into a stable state, and some weapons haven't been touched ever since they were added to the game in the first place. I don't know, symmetry just makes me smile in a weird way, and it makes me happy that Valve employs similar balancing philosophies into their weapons with moderate success most of the time. Yeah, Valve has been known previously for making some weapons pretty unbalanced on release because of their insanely strong stats. But what's currently the strongest in the game today? In this video, I'm going to present to you what I believe is the definitive best upside out of all weapons in TF2, along with many honourable mentions. If you're liking this video so far, would you please consider subscribing and leaving a comment down below right now predicting what you think the strongest weapon stat in TF2 is. But for now, let's begin. So I have a few things to go over as to how I've decided this criteria, and the first one, and the most important one being, these stats are being judged in a vacuum. I'm not judging how good these stats are on the weapon, I'm not judging how good these stats would be on that class. I'm simply judging them purely in a vacuum, and then how well they perform on every other class. For example, let's consider the L'Etranger's 40% extra cloak duration. This is a fantastic stat for spies all around the globe, however this stat would be completely and utterly useless on every other class in the game, so therefore in the context of our ranking, this is a bad stat. Judging these statistics in a vacuum allows us to see just how strong they are, and therefore how strong they'd also be on other classes and weapons. This leads me nicely into my second point, that any statistic that is directly tied to a class-specific mechanic is not eligible for this list. Anything that reduces the amount of damage you take from blast jumping, ineligible. Anything that increases your shield recharge, ineligible. Anything related to cloak, anything related to accessing the metal pool that the class has, utterly ineligible. And whilst we're at it, I'm also going to go in and say that anything that produces a meter is utterly ineligible for this list as well. However, this does not mean the weapons themselves are ineligible. Something like the conch, for example, we can't consider the meter, however we can consider the passive health regeneration to be on this list. And the last thing to note is that everything that appears on this list, and for what I consider to be the strongest stats of the game, are entirely opinionated. You may disagree, and that is absolutely fine. Not all of these opinions belong to me, however, as I sat down with my mods in a 2-hour Discord call as we went through every single stat in TF2 trying to decide what was the strongest. So a huge thank you to my mods for helping me with this list, thank you to you for watching so far, and let's get started. So I personally feel we should start with the candy cane's upsides, as I did make a joke about it in the intro. So the singular upside for the candy cane, and the one we're going to be talking about in this section, is that for every kill you get, the enemy drops a small health pack. Yet I personally think the blue stats of this weapon should really be read as this, as, well, just dropping a small health pack for every kill in a shooting game is an insanely strong feature. Imagine if this ability were on a weapon for every other class in the game. Every class would gain fantastic supporting capabilities. Every other class in the game would be immune to afterburn and bleed if they were able to take out the target. Soldiers and demos going for dive bombs could heal up a small amount of the damage they took from blast jumping. And if you were pocketing someone as a medic, he would be able to generate infinite health packs for you to collect. The caveat to all of this is, of course, you have to pick up the health pack before the enemy does. And that's the same reason why, within good faith, this stat couldn't really go anywhere near towards the top 3. But it's still insanely good, and I would be heavily remiss if I did not mention it on this list. Wow, if this stat's so good, why don't people use this weapon? Oh yeah, that's why. Okay, let's continue on with Scout here and talk about the next stat that we didn't quite think was strong enough to make it into the top 3. That being the Atomizer's triple jump. Yes, triple jump. As we are analysing these stats in a vacuum, this says grants the character a triple jump while active. This is not a double jump, this is a triple jump, and that means if you were to give this stat to any other class's weapons, they would be able to perform 3 jumps. This is obviously an insanely strong stat, however there is kind of a downside within this stat in that the weapon has to be active for this to be deployed. Let's say that this stat were going to be added onto any other weapon from any other class. That would be great if it were added to a primary or maybe even a secondary, but if it were added to a melee on anything else other than a typical Demo Knight weapon, we might see some issues there, as most classes shouldn't really be using their melees unless they either have to or they provide some sort of utility. So yes, whilst giving every class a triple jump would be an insane feat of any means, the use that this ability would see would be drastically different depending as to whether this were placed onto a primary, secondary or melee weapon for any other class. But as a heavy main, I'd take a triple jump on any weapon regardless of what slot it filled. So the next upside on our list was originally going to be the rocket jumper's plus 200% primary ammo on wearer. And then I realised there's a stat on some weapons that means you just don't need ammo to begin with. Now, running out of ammo isn't the biggest problem in the world if you're playing TF2 semi-decently, yet it is still quite an annoying thing to run into. And having an infinite amount of ammo with pretty much any weapon in the game would always be a good thing, and for some weapons this would be an utterly fantastic thing that would mean the class would never have to properly reposition as long as they find a good stable spot. And considering how this stat can only currently be found on projectile-based weapons, if we were to experiment by giving this to a hit scan weapon for example with any other class, I feel there would be some pretty big problems. So yeah, enjoy this slightly smaller section of the video as there's really not much else to talk about here apart from the fact that having infinite ammo with every class with any weapon would always be a bonus. And speaking of smaller sections of the video and soldier, let's quickly talk about the black box. So the black box's one upside is that you gain 20 health per hit with every attack. Now this of course on some slightly faster firing characters would be insanely good, however there's also another hidden downside to this in that it is healing ramp up based, so the closer you are to the target the more health you will be healing. And generally this means you're not going to be healing the full health every time. I would still choose this stat however over its direct contender within this slot, that being the Lon'qudor's consistent 3 health per hit. Because within my testings the average health you're going to be healing with the soldier in the black box is somewhere in between the mid to lower teens, and with the Lon'qudor it's just consistently 3. So of course these stats would be good on any weapon with insanely fast fire, however I think the black box is just better. Now within the video we're at the turning point in which I personally considered any of the following stats to be maybe the third or even the second strongest stat in the game, so let's cover them one by one. So the first one we get to talk about belongs to one of my favourite weapons within the entirety of TF2, and that is the back scratcher. So the back scratcher possesses an upside that allows the player to heal an extra 50% of the health from the current health pack they're receiving. So this counts for small health packs and medium health packs, and it does technically count for large health packs, but not in practice. Giving this stat to any other weapon on any other class would just simply be insane, as everyone could potentially become a much stronger Roman than they currently are now. However, I feel this stat would actually be the most beneficial on some of the higher health classes, as naturally, with a higher health pool, you get more healing from a percentage-based healing pack. And yes, in case you're wondering, this would mean you would heal more health from eating heavy sandwiches. That's the second win for heavy mains in this video. Now furthering along the topic of heavy mains, wins and videos, we cannot talk about insanely strong stats without bringing up the Fists of Steel. So this weapon has basically seen nothing but nerfs ever since its implementation for its insane upside of minus 40% damage taken from all ranged sources while active. But now I hear you thinking, well, you criticise the Atomizer for only having its bonuses while active, so why aren't you criticising the Fists of Steel? My simple answer is I just feel this stat is generally more applicable to more weapon types, be them primaries, secondaries or melees. If you only had a triple jump tied to your melee, it would still see limited use regardless of how strong that is. But if you only had this stat tied to your melee like it currently is for heavy, you still see fantastic use out of it. And to me personally, I still prefer pure brain dead defensive options compared to ones where you have to put in just the tiniest amount of work. Now I'm just quickly adding this in post editing as at different points during this script's rewrite I did consider every single heavy melee for this slot in one way or another. Even the two objectively bad ones, because they too have insanely strong stats on them in a vacuum anyway. But eventually I ended up choosing the Fists of Steel over, for example, the KGB's crits and the Holiday Punch's crits making people laugh, and the 30% movement speed universal that will be given by the gloves with gloving urgently. I just feel the Fists of Steel stats are just that much stronger and would be that much better on every class as a whole. But if you believe I'm wrong in this choice and would like to convince me otherwise, I'm more than happy to heart your comment if you can make a valid point towards it. Again, this was one of the harder parts of the video to decide, but I did eventually end up choosing the choice I did, yet I am more than willing to be talked out of it. And now the final two weapons we have to talk about before we get to the top three are the Force of Nature and the Soda Popper joint, because they both share the exact same stat of a 50% faster firing speed. Now as someone who's an avid heavy main and a frequent MVM enjoyer, I understand just how strong a fast firing speed can be. Taking this stat off these two weapons and putting it onto any other weapon in the game would just be absurd. Like, imagine the stock scattergun firing at the same speed as the Soda Popper, or imagine demos spamming stickies at speeds you couldn't believe. One of the main reasons as to why I think this stat is great is that there's no weapon in the game I can really think of that would be negatively affected by having this thrown onto it. Now I bring this up because a couple of the mentions in the top three kind of would negatively affect some weapons if they were added to them, yet at the same time I still feel if the majority of TF2 weapons were to be given these three stats, they'd be considered overpowered within seconds. Let's talk about those stats anyway. So we have finally reached what I believe to be the three strongest upsides in the entirety of TF2. So let's kick this thing off with the third one, being the Panic Attacks fires in a wide fixed shot pattern stat. So, to explain to you why this is such a good stat to have, let me first learn you about a little mechanic called Random Bullet Spread! Random Bullet Spread is one of the most hated mechanics in TF2. What it is, it's basically whenever you shoot a gun, that means the bullets will appear in a randomised pattern. Your first shot, however, is normally 100% accurate. Like for example with pistols, the first shot will always be over the crosshair and all subsequent shots will just be utterly randomised. Now, why is this such a big deal? Well, this is such a big deal because it means sometimes when you're playing TF2, you are being punished through no fault of your own. This means that multi-shot weapons like scatterguns and shotguns will sometimes just have the bullets go in random places. Sometimes you'll be dealing more damage to the enemy, sometimes you'll be dealing less damage, and it is entirely not your fault whatsoever. So as you probably well know by now, most TF2 players hate randomness. What's the point in putting hundreds of hours into something if someone can come along, just happen to roll a dice and end up being better than you? What I'm trying to say is that randomness is the enemy of consistency, and consistency in TF2 is really fun. And now this is where the panic attack stat comes in, as this weapon has no random bullet spread whatsoever, meaning your shots will always appear in the same pattern, and therefore your shots will always either hit or miss the opponent depending on how skilled you are. Even as someone who doesn't really mind random crits, I absolutely hate random bullet spread, and this is kind of why I love the panic attack. Now, there is a downside I have to address with this upside, and this is why it could not make the #1 spot, and that is because it fires in a wide pattern. Not every gun in the game is going to be wanting to fire in a wide pattern, and I don't even know how this would work on something like a pistol, and obviously things like the flamethrower wouldn't be affected by this. But just for the pure idea that it removes random bullet spread in some way or form, it has to go pretty high on the list, and I'm pretty comfortable in putting it in 3rd place. Now, the 2nd place and 3rd place were fighting for contention for a very long time, however I've ultimately decided on the 2nd place being the Islanders giving increased health and speed with every head you take. Now do allow me to explain this one, as I personally don't consider taking heads to be a meter mechanic or any of the sort. Yes, it is a snowballing mechanic, yet it is something that can very easily be passed on to something else. Something like the Bizarre Bargain snowballing mechanic, for example, only works if you have the ability to scope and you have the ability to charge shots. Other snowballing weapons like the airstrike, for example, would also be ineligible, as you have to actively be blast jumping for the bonus to take place. And in case you're wondering about the Babyface's blaster, these are 2 separate upsides. Yes, it is one mechanic, but these are 2 separate upsides, and in a vacuum, neither of these mean anything. And no, just because the text is not blue on the Islander does not mean it cannot be on this list. But with those out of the way, let's talk about how insanely strong this would be. So the Islander gives the demo man an 8% movement speed bonus upon kill, along with an extra 15 health. These bonuses stack up to a number of 4 times, meaning that if we were to give this to any other class as well, they would get an extra 60 health and an extra 32% movement speed from max heads. Now, this is a flat movement speed buff. This is not a percentage based one, even though it is technically labelled as a percentage based one. These bonuses would be insane for every class. Every single class in the game would benefit from a health bonus and a speed bonus. But my favourite of course has to be Scout, who would be running around at 165 speed and with 185 health. That would be unstoppable. With these bonuses stacked, everyone could survive sniper headshots and everyone could get out of the snipers way quicker. With these bonuses stacked, everyone could get to the objective quicker. With these bonuses stacked, everyone would just be an insanely much more powerful, insane class, TF2. So, this surely has to be the best upside in the entire game, right? No. I think there's one that's actually better, and I know there's going to be some contention around this, but to me, it doesn't come anywhere close. I think the single greatest upside in TF2 belongs to the Widowmaker, and it's the upside that reads, no reload necessary. Let me paint you a picture here. Imagine soldiers being able to fire off 24 rockets without stopping. Imagine demo men being able to spam 20 pills without stopping. Imagine snipers being able to shoot 25 times in a row with no breaks in between. Imagine scorched shot pyros being able to spam 16 area of effect flares at the choke point whenever they want to. Imagine the soda popper firing off 34 shots with no breaks in between. Imagine a Frontier Justice engineer taking his 32 stacked crits and just going nuts with them. You get the idea by now, surely. This is the strongest upside within the entirety of TF2. It basically means that no class has any reserve ammo, but every class's reserve ammo becomes their clip. When I was in the Discord call and I preached this to my mob friends, we all agreed. There was absolutely no competition here whatsoever. And I guess I'll just say one more time, we are specifically judging these stats in a vacuum. So yes, the Widowmaker draws its ammo from the Engineer's metal pool, but no reloads necessary in a vacuum is the strongest stat in TF2. Wow, if this stat's so good, why don't people use this weapon? Okay, it wasn't as funny the second time. Did you disagree with anything on this list? Did you think I've missed anything major? Let me know down below, and leave a like if you liked it. A list like this will always be subjective and will always be opinionated, and I have probably missed something that you're currently screaming at the screen waiting for me to mention. I assume a lot of people are going to ask where would the Ambassador come into this, and where would the Kunai come into this, and my answers are, pre-Jungle Inferno I would have considered the Ambassador, but currently there's too much to consider as most weapons at close range are going to be one-shotting people anyway, so it doesn't really matter if you can headshot them, and the Kunai's effect only triggers on a backstab, so that makes it ineligible for this list. Do let me know down below though what you would have included, and I can always make a part 2, but I would much rather make the sequel that I'm going to be working on pretty soon after this releases anyway, being what is the worst stat in TF2. And I've already picked out my number 1, but let me know down below what you think should appear on that list. But for now, thank you very much everyone for watching this, I've had a good time making it, and I will see you later down the sunny road.